Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into a brand new explainer, and this one is all about the very engine of human discovery. We're breaking down Dr. Chem's 8 steps of the scientific method. But listen, we're not going to treat this like some dusty, rigid textbook checklist. No way. Instead, we're going to look at the real deal, the dynamic, sometimes chaotic, and honestly wonderfully messy cycle of actual scientific discovery. We're going to explore how science truly works behind the scenes, from that very first spark of observation all the way to communicating the final results to the world. All right, here's a quick look at our roadmap. We'll be hitting observation and identifying questions, formulating a falsifiable hypothesis, designing controlled experiments, collecting and analyzing data, drawing theories and conclusions, and finally, communicating and reproducing results. Let's get right into it. Starting things off with Phase 1. Observation and identifying questions. Now, observation is definitely not just a one-and-done kind of deal. To be a great researcher, you've got to be, well, the fancy word is sagacious, basically clever enough to spot those weird real-world anomalies, the bugs in the system, or totally unexpected results. It's this constant cyclical loop, right? You observe something, you look for a relationship, you make a prediction, and then you naturally loop right back around to check for changes and observe all over again. It's an endless flow of engaging with the world. And as we're making these observations, we're pulling in 2 distinct types of data. You've got your qualitative observations. These use descriptive words, like saying a chemical reaction turned bright blue or a car drove by super quickly. Then you've got quantitative observations, which give us the hard numbers, like measuring that the car was driving at exactly 50 kilometers per hour. Now, both are absolutely vital, but in science, those quantitative, number-based observations are usually the heavy hitters. Why? Because they rely on tools, like balances and thermometers, to basically extend the reach of our totally unaided, pretty limited human senses. But here's where the messy reality of science really shines. Did you know that serendipity, happy accidents, plays a massive role in discovery? Actually, researchers estimate that anywhere from 33 to 50% of all scientific discoveries are just completely unexpected. Seriously. But, and this is a big but, as Louis Pasteur so perfectly put it, chance favors only the prepared mind. You really have to know exactly what normal looks like to even realize you've stumbled onto something brand new. Moving right along to Phase 2, formulating a falsifiable hypothesis. Okay, the absolutely crucial standard here is something called falsifiability. This was introduced by the philosopher Karl Popper, and essentially it means a true scientific inquiry doesn't just start with a conclusion that you stubbornly refuse to change. Nope, your hypothesis has to be structured in such a way that an empirical observation could literally prove it wrong. If a statement can't theoretically be proven false, well, it just isn't science. And to keep things strictly rigorous, researchers lean heavily on something called the null hypothesis. Think of this as the ultimate default position. It simply assumes there is absolutely zero relationship between the things you're observing. So as a scientist, you aren't actually setting out to prove yourself right. You're setting out to relentlessly test against this default null hypothesis. That way, you ensure you aren't just magically finding the results you secretly want to see. Which brings us to Phase 3, designing controlled experiments. Now, this is exactly where the perfectly idealized scientific method slams headfirst into messy human reality. Even the most seasoned researchers can stumble when trying to manage experimental variables. Subconscious bias has this incredibly sneaky way of creeping in. Maybe it's design bias in how you actually build the test, or sampling bias in who you choose to test, or the big one, confirmation bias, where you unconsciously favor the data that backs up what you were hoping to find. If you fail to strictly isolate your variables, or if you neglect your control groups, you can completely compromise the scientific integrity of the whole project, even if you have the absolute best intentions. So how do we fight that? Well, the scientific community has developed some pretty robust structural safeguards. To stop researchers from inadvertently cherry-picking their outcomes, modern science relies on a few key tools. We use randomization. We use blinding so the people making observations don't actually know which sample is which, and we use pre-registration to literally lock in the rules of the game before anyone even starts playing. Next up, Phase 4, collecting and analyzing data. Once your experiment is actually up and running, a whole new layer of dramatic tension kicks in. It's all about exactly how scientists interpret the data they're pulling in. And a major pitfall right here is a tricky practice called p-hacking. What is that? Well, it's when researchers peek at their results mid-experiment just to decide if they should stop or keep going. Or sometimes they'll measure dozens of different outcomes and then just selectively report the single one that looks statistically significant. It's basically gaming the system, right? Sure, it might technically adhere to the letter of the scientific method, but it entirely violates the spirit of objective discovery. And that is exactly why that pre-registration safeguard we just talked about is such a massive game changer. Submitting your hypothesis and your analysis plan to a third party before you collect a single piece of data keeps everyone honest. There's actually this great anecdote from a graduate student named Hannah Watkins. She noted that having her analysis plan locked in early totally stopped her from tumbling down a totally biased rabbit hole after she looked at her data. It just makes sheer honesty a standard, built-in part of the daily routine.
All right, on to Phase 5, drawing theories and conclusions.
Okay, we need to clear something up, because there is this incredibly common misconception out there that a scientific theory is just some vague stab-in-the-dark guess. In reality, a hypothesis is that initial assumption you're testing, but a scientific theory, that is a heavily corroborated, massive principle used to explain things that have already been shown in the data. Think about gravity, evolution, or plate tectonics. These theories apply to huge ranges of phenomena and are backed by mountains of rigorously tested evidence. So you really can't just wave away solid science by saying, oh, it's just a theory. But even with all that massive backing, scientific knowledge is always tentative. It is always subject to revision. Like the brilliant physicist Richard Feynman pointed out, it really doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is or how wildly smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's just wrong. At the end of the day, the empirical data always wins. Finally, we reach Phase 6, communicating and reproducing results. Look, for individual lab work to ever become globally accepted science, it has to be communicated crystal clearly. You know that super strict, kind of dry formatting of lab reports? Introduction, experimental methods, results, discussion, conclusions? Yeah, that isn't just useless bureaucracy. That standardization is the exact thing that allows peers to replicate the work and relentlessly scrutinize it for any major sources of error. And that rigorous scrutiny relies heavily on understanding two very distinct concepts: repeatability and reproducibility. Repeatability simply means the original team can run it back and get the exact same results again. That's great, but true scientific validity absolutely requires reproducibility. That means the experiment is described so perfectly that an entirely independent team in a totally different lab, maybe across the world, can run it and get the exact same results. It proves the discovery wasn't just some random fluke or a weird glitch in one specific lab setup. However, modern science is actually battling something right now called the reproducibility crisis. Because researchers are under immense pressure to publish or perish, scientific journals heavily favor exciting, positive outcomes. Null results, experiments that just showed no effect at all, they rarely ever see the light of day. This system actively rewards positive results, and honestly, it creates a wildly distorted picture of the evidence base. It ends up hiding all those crucial failures that other scientists desperately need to learn from. So why does this entire process matter to you and me sitting outside the lab? Because ultimately, scientific literacy is a massive public health concern. Really understanding these 8 steps, and specifically the sneaky human biases that constantly threaten them, empowers all of us. It empowers us to critically evaluate the things that impact our daily lives, whether that's the regulation of the pharmaceutical and food industries, or trying to make sense of huge environmental studies on things like city air pollution. I want to leave you with this final, hopefully thought-provoking question. If even the best, most well-intentioned researchers can routinely fall prey to cognitive biases they can't even see, what does that actually say about the fragility and simultaneously the incredible self-correcting power of the scientific method? And as a whole society, are we actually doing enough to ensure that rigorous, negative research gets the spotlight it truly deserves? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep observing, and I'll catch you in the next one.